I'm your host, Grayson Pulte. Welcome to another episode of SAE Tomorrow Today, a show about emerging technology and trends mobility with leaders and innovators to make it all happen. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to be joined by Jason Greenblatt, Senior Practice Consultant, Energy Sustainability Consulting, Energetics. On today's episode, we'll explore how the evolving landscape of electric vehicle infrastructure with insights on public and fleet charging and how all this data is driving the adoption of electric vehicles. We hope you enjoy this episode. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Your firm has really cool, interesting data. I read the reports and said, wow, there's a lot to unpack there. But before we get into really great data sets, I love to know, how are your customers thinking about making EV investments today, both in terms of fleets and private ownership? Since it's two different sides of the market, but they're working together.
Yeah, I think on the fleet side, it's, in the market in 2025, we've got some back and forth kind of financial incentives and disincentives and different focus from the government. So we've definitely seen a little bit on the fleet side in terms of people realizing they don't need to do what they thought they had to do for compliance, at least with the state of California. On the other hand, my coworkers and other parts of the company are definitely supporting fleets really all around the country who are trying to move forwards with electric vehicles. Some of them are for compliance, some of them are for just sustainability goals, some of them are, just think it's the right thing to do economically. So that's kind of all over the place. And, we're helping people look at what parts of their fleets are the easiest or the hardest or the shortest term or whatever to kind of make that jump, whether it's, I think light duty vehicles at this point, 15 years in is kind of a little more straightforward for most people. On the kind of light duty residential side, though, I think it's, it's kind of like the new in some cases. People are hopeful they're going to save some money. There's a little bit of a sustainability thing going on there. In terms of like the market adoption curve, we're past the early adopters. We're definitely somewhere in the middle, if not the third phase of that adoption curve. So EVs, not everybody's driven one, not everybody's interested in one, but everybody's kind of heard about it. And, we've seen multiple generations. So it's just kind of something that a lot of people seem open to and interested in, and especially with some of the big brand name charging networks, it makes it so easy to charge, if not road trip. So yeah, I think it's just becoming more and more common for people to think about it as their next car or their next toy car for a 2-year lease or something like that. Part of my interest is trying to help people find confidence and security and convenience with it, so that they choose to keep it beyond their lease or keep it for a long term or keep staying in the EV market and don't go back to a conventional car, or at least put as many miles on their electric car or plug-in hybrid car as possible. So
you hit the nail on the head. Convenience. I own an electric vehicle and I had to go to a gas station to put air in the tires. I felt like this is the most antiquated thing in the world. I said, holy God, I don't miss this place. But it just hit me because you're so used to the convenience of the EV. There's no oil change and those get expensive, and it's just, you can charge at home or you can charge on the go. And when you get used to that overall, I'm on my second EV. My first one was a disaster. My second one is amazing because the infrastructure is much better, but it's like, okay, this is so convenient. Why would I want to go back to something inconvenient? Do you see any of that in your trade, both from a fleet perspective, because the maintenance is cheaper from a fleet, and from a personal ownership, you have the convenience? Is that once we get used to it, whoa, this is great? Is that trend continuing, or am I just an outlier in that?
I think they're just such different markets. I mean, the residential passenger vehicle side is just so much about being able to make their own decisions and not having to necessarily justify it. So I think that convenience side is so super important on the residential side, and that's one of the biggest challenges. Is such a large proportion of the U.S. population lives in apartments or condos and doesn't have their own place to charge or a convenient place to charge. And so some people will try it, and because of that lack of convenience, it may not work out for them. They may not be able to keep it. And so what we're seeing is like workplace charging is super important. That's what a lot of the industry has been touting for the last 10 to 20 years is workplace charging really makes up for residential charging. You go there, at least we used to go to work 5 days a week and spend a lot of time there, a lot of dwell time. That's what a lot of, from my perspective, a lot of the EV charging comes down to is dwell time. What's your opportunity to charge your vehicle? So on the residential side, especially if you have a house or a dedicated parking space where you can get electricity to it, you're doing pretty good. I think there's a lot of arbitrage in terms of what's the right cost, and with some of the work I'm doing now, and with my coworkers and my team, we're kind of digging into, at least in terms of public charging, what's the range of costs? How many charging stations have low costs, high costs, medium costs? How frequently is that happening, and how's it compared to the cost of gasoline? So at some point, that's kind of the reckoning is how convenient is it? How economical is it? And that economical side has a lot to do with fleet. On the other hand, even fleets have to think about how well do their employees, how well do their drivers accept the vehicles? And that definitely seems to be another challenge, is getting people who, drive for a living to accept EVs and trust them. So there's a lot of, similar, but just different concepts going into either market, especially when you start getting into commercial sized vehicles.
Yeah, and that's a very valid point. The range of cost, what goes into that? And does the price of land factor in? If you look at an industrial yard might have a cheaper piece of land versus something in a prime downtown area, does that get factored into the cost to charge, or what really goes into that whole equation?
That's a really good question. I wish I was a little closer to that. I think some of the research we're doing and reporting we're doing in this 562 pages of goodness kind of gets at what that range of cost is and frequency of any particular cost is. From what we've seen, it's I'm not seeing patterns, at least on the public side, in terms of the cost of installing charging and the location of charging impacting what rates these operators make available to the general public. So that's hard to say. I would definitely say, we start looking at the industrial side or the commercial side, there's larger parking lots that might add cost because you got to get a further distance away from where the electricity is to where the chargers are. On the other hand, a lot of those larger lots are asphalt or dirt, softscape, that makes it a lot lower cost to do the projects. So overall, I get the feeling we're seeing a lot of kind of random pricing. We see a lot of the same operators, the same network service providers, for instance, running these charging stations. But in which case we'll see, they'll have a kind of a common pricing structure taking place. But I'm not really seeing any specific patterns associated with, pricing here versus pricing there. And, there's a couple of high priced ones, 60, 70 cents a kilowatt hour, which is definitely getting high. There's a couple of low ones in the 30 cents. We've seen a couple of maybe semi-private or private locations that are providing free charging just because they like the benefits. But so far, I'm not necessarily seeing the connection between the cost of building compared to the cost of operating these things. It's still Wild West, I think.
I agree with that. If you look at gas stations, a gas station across our mall is going to be more for the gas than one that's a couple miles down the road. And same thing immediately off the highway, it's going to be more. And then they'll say, oh, it's convenience. And you and I both know they can get it. So that's how they do it. Are we seeing that in EV charging based on any of that?
I would say I don't think we're seeing that same high priced gas on the side of the highway and cheaper when you go a mile or two away from the highway. I'm not necessarily seeing trends in that case, to be honest. I think it's more this charging network has their own pricing policy. I will say there's some pretty good diversity here, and one of the big things we're seeing is at least in California, most of our electricity is time of use based. So the cost of electricity varies by what time of day and sometimes even day of, weekend versus weekday and seasonally. I'm seeing a pretty big mix in these public oriented charging sites some of them are just flat rates, same pricing all the time. And some of them are carrying over the same kind of model that utility is applying to the operators in terms of time of use pricing, different pricing at times of day. So I think there's a lot of experimentation going on, and I'm not sure how much an analysis is really taking place. But one of my big concerns is, if you price it too high, then these assets aren't going to get used a whole lot, and that's definitely a concern because they're expensive to build. It might not be good for the business model if utilization doesn't ramp up, and it's certainly not doing anybody with EVs favors if it ends up being a resource they don't want to use. So that's one of the things I'm trying to support with my team is put out, what that pricing is and how competitive it is, and hopefully draw conclusions or some sort of relationship to utilization and cost, and try to find something that's generally a win-win for as many people as possible.
When you and your firm are publishing really good data, I want to highlight your 2024 report here, because in your 2024 report, you noted that there was a steep increase in weekday demand at 9 p.m. Is that, as you just said, is that time of use? Is the cost dramatically go down? What causes that spike that you were able to uncover in your report?
Okay, so I think what you're talking about is specific to fleet charging in this case, on the commercial side of things. There's a few kind of points of view there, but generally speaking, 4 to 9 p.m. is when the price goes up dramatically. Could be double, could be 4 or 5 times, and then the price drops again at 9 p.m. So what we've seen is about 250 fleets were part of this most recent report. We're going to be closer to 325 or around 300 for this next report we're going to be doing in about 6 months. Overall, a small percentage, maybe 20%, 25% of those 250 fleets are actually doing what we call load management or charging management. So basically, they're paying attention to the utility costs and have programmed some sort of automation using their software to influence when the vehicles charge and mitigate their utility bills. And so what we're seeing from this relatively small number of fleets is a pretty big impact in terms of avoiding charging when the cost is highest. And the cost is usually highest because of congestion, and that has to do with a bunch of different variables. But basically, that 4 to 9 p.m. is higher cost, higher demand, higher emissions. And come 9 p.m., people are realizing that they can save a bunch of money and charge at that point. So it's very interesting to see a small number of operators having a very notable impact on the grid. And, from what I'm seeing, it's pretty spiky. So instead of vehicles slowly rolling back and charging immediately, starting at 2 p.m., 3 p.m., 4 p.m., and just kind of, one at a time, slowly coming back and ramping up their charging, they're all coming to base, plugging in, and waiting for a few hours until 9 p.m. and charging. And that's good because it's avoiding the highest cost, highest emissions time of the day. But then we are seeing this 9 p.m. spike, which is a little less of an issue, but something that could definitely save some people money, and probably, at least in terms of operations, for the people that are paying for electricity based on how fast they charge. And that's another function besides time of use, is people are paying for how fast they're actually consuming energy. And when we see something as spiky as that, generally it means they're not charging for very long, and they could slow down their charging. And that's a kind of relevant to a term we've come up with the last few years called charging flexibility, which is looking at how long a given vehicle is connected to a charging station and how long it needs to charge versus how long it is charging. So there's some good news in there, and there's some notes to take home and maybe put feedback into the hopper in terms of the operational hopper. I think there's a lot of work for consultants like my company to do, and the utilities and fleet operators. A lot of learning, even 15 years in at this point with the EV market, a lot of learning left to do.
So just so we're on the same page for myself and our listeners here, 9:01 p.m. Pacific time is the great charge off. Is that a good way to look at it for fleets?
Yeah, I think overall it's a win, because we are seeing that some of the more sophisticated fleets have the right hardware, the right vehicles, and the right software that they're able to program, and they've got the right staff that's paying attention to what they've learned working with their utility partners, and they're doing the great charge off at 9 p.m. That's a new term you get to keep. We're gonna credit you with that. So it is pretty cool to see that. And, I think I'm looking at one of the charts right now, and we see just, again, from like 2 p.m. on, just constant more vehicles coming in, amount of charging increasing from about 2 p.m. all the way out to, still 9 p.m., 10 p.m. And then it all kind of drops off. So it's good to see that technology is working. There's I think, for those companies that are doing the great 9 p.m. charge off, there's a little tweaking to do, but they're honestly examples that we point to all the time, showing that software works, hardware works. We can do really phenomenal things to keep costs down and maybe improve how much renewable energy are going into these vehicles. So it's a very impressive trend to see, and something we'd like to get more of those fleets to enact, basically.
As more fleets, I'm just going to use random numbers here. Let's say 5% of fleets will probably go to 10, 20%, 30%, 4%, and they go to the great charge off. Can the grid handle that? Because there's a mix of vehicles here. You're going to have a class 6 that can charge. Perhaps you're going to have a class 8. Then you're going to have your utility vans. You're going to have your passenger vehicles that operate in a fleet. Can the grid handle all that as the percentage of fleets that are electrified start to go for this great charge off?
That's a really fun question, and I'm going to try to split the difference here between what a lot of messages are saying. Depending on your media source, we could be in a really good place, we could be in a really bad place. I think from what I'm seeing, we've got a long ways to go. And one of the reasons that 9 p.m. charge off is happening is because demand is generally a lot lower. Residential load is dipping off at 9 p.m., 10 p.m., and staying pretty low until the next morning. Commercial load is dipping off. So all of this grid capacity that's been built is much lower at that point. That's why pricing has dropped. So that does give us a good bit of flexibility. But in terms of the overall grid, some people talk about how the grid, the U.S. grid, the North American grid, is the biggest machine in the world, or something like that, the biggest interconnected system. So there's a lot to look at, but there's a lot of different nodes. There's a lot of different regions. And one of the things we're seeing, especially in these bigger projects, whether it's maybe charging for 50 school buses or charging for 20 semi trucks or something like that, depending on where they are, especially in urban centers, and most of my experience is around California, while the overall grid, especially on the transmission side, is less of an issue, these nodes, these distribution networks, could run out of capacity, and it could take significant time for the utility to bring in enough capacity. And so from my perspective, seeing that charge off at 9 p.m., it's great to see these fleets paying attention and avoiding the highest cost time period of the day. But when they're charging faster than they need to, they've built enough capacity to do that. And they might not need that, which means if fleet A gets to build their infrastructure first, that may, depending on the region, have an impact on how much capacity is left for fleet B, C, D, or even just, the residential over here, in the next neighborhood over. So there is a lot of capacity, but I think it's really important to look at how much time we have to charge and using as much of it as possible. For the most part, I think there's little things where, maybe we see there's a spike in wind energy coming in, or for some reason we got a whole bunch of solar energy. And then maybe we want everybody charging as fast as possible whenever that is, which is typically more like middle of the afternoon on the solar side of things. So yeah, I probably didn't answer you totally directly there, but it's a perspective, and there's definitely some easy wins and some harder wins in this case.
It was a great answer, which opens up a lot more. I'll put my curiosity hat on. Did you ever get to a point in the data or your 15 years of experience where have you seen utilities throttle at certain points based on capacity constraints? And have you seen anything like that ever occur?
Yeah, so prior to really the electric vehicle boom here over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a long-term kind of program topic called demand response, where when the utilities see something, it could be maintenance is taking place on any piece of infrastructure, and they know that in advance. They can tell their certain customers, hey, we're going to need you at certain times to ramp down your throttle, or especially in California, there could be a forecasted very hot day where there's going to be congestion, or everybody's going to be running their AC, so we're concerned about generation resources and transmission and distribution resources. And so the utilities will tell their certain customers who have signed up for their programs day in advance, typically in the evening, hey, can you throttle down your load later on the next day, usually between maybe like 4 p.m. and 9 p.m., maybe a little bit earlier than that. So that demand response program is probably, I'm thinking, at least 20 years old, maybe 40 years old in that case. And that translates onto the electric vehicle side. We've seen there's a few different examples. There was in one utility territory in California about 10 years ago, there's a program that started that was all about near real-time pricing. So basically the utility would forecast every day of the year in advance and publish prices for the following day. And sometimes the prices would be 2 or 3 times higher, maybe 4 times higher than typically. And instead of the utility throttling or a specific operator throttling power, it kind of came down to the individual EV drivers to say, well, maybe I'll take 150% pricing, but I don't want 200% pricing. I don't want 300% pricing. And so we saw some pretty significant load curtailment based on individuals making that decision themselves, either looking at the pricing every day or generally speaking, knowing what the pricing was as an educated midterm, long-term EV driver and saying, I'm never going to accept pricing energy over, such and such price. We've seen some other stuff more recently in terms of one of the utilities has a program where they're aware that, in certain parts of their territory, there's limited capacity. And so if you opt into their specific program, they'll basically allow you to run full power pretty much all the time and then tell you a couple of hours every day where you need to throttle it down. I don't want to say or else, but basically, or the price goes up very significantly. So that's been something that we've really only seen one example of a school bus project doing that with a lot of school buses, and that's pretty similar to the example I gave before. And then over the last couple of years, there's a new program, the Emergency Load Reduction Program, that each of the main California utilities is participating in, and they have a similar basically program to demand response. They'll tell their customers day in advance, hey, from these hours on this date, can you throttle down? And in some cases, participants are actually doing vehicle to grid, sending energy from the vehicles back into the back through the chargers to the grid. And so there's 3 or 4 flavors of that emergency load reduction program people are participating in. So that throttling concept has been around in different capacities for a long time at this point, and especially as we're getting into the electric vehicle world, and EVs are just such a cool concept that everybody's been talking about for so long, because vehicles generally sit for a long time throughout the year, throughout the week, throughout the day. So they have a lot of flexibility, and that gives us the opportunity to kind of pick and choose when they charge for better emissions, for better costs, for whatever the grid needs under special circumstances. So more and more examples like that are coming out, and we've been able to document a couple of those in this report series.
I had a conversation a few weeks ago with a significant private equity fund that is going and buying real estate around airports to build charging stations for large fleets that are going to operate at the airports. That's their whole model. And I want to highlight one part of the conversation, and I'll remove the firm's name for privacy. But the granular detail they went in on the power grid and the charts that they showed me, they had the map around LAX where the DWP and Con Ed lines were. And they wanted to buy land on one of them, privacy again, because they can get more power, better rates. Are you seeing that throughout California where these depots are being built and they're kind of looking at utility maps? Well, this utility can get a little bit better rate and I can get more capacity. Are you was this a one-off that I experienced with this one fund, or is this more commonplace from a fleet perspective?
I think I think that's got more to do with the term these days has a lot to do with charging as a service. So somebody that will finance a project, build a project, operate a project, maybe even buy the vehicles and operate the vehicles. So for a long time, the utilities, especially here in California, have had that opportunity to kind of put out in the public domain what the capacity is in different nodes, different spots around the grid. And that's been more to do historically, I think, with net metering, with solar installations, for instance. But it's becoming more pertinent now with the EV charging side of things. From what I've seen the last couple of years, that's got more to do with these charging as a service providers. And you referenced the airport example. We've also seen some examples lately that are very, port oriented. I mean, something like 40% of imports to the U.S. comes through the ports of L.A. and Long Beach. So we are seeing, a little bit more focus of truck depot charging, heavy duty truck depot charging around there. And, the kind of tertiary side of things is those trucks have to go somewhere. And we're seeing those depot chargers 50 miles, 75, 100 miles away from LA and Long Beach to support those trucks going to rail yards, going to other territories, basically. So we are seeing it. It's got a lot to do with how to support this and this market, and definitely making some long-term decisions going back several years, and of course we're seeing a lot of topsy-turvy influences here in 2025. So a lot of people have made some investments and have said what they're going to do, and they're sticking to it, which is really, I think, cool to see, having been in the market this long. And I'll just say, 10 years ago, we didn't see EV semi-trucks, and I've seen dozens and dozens of them, and we're tracking consumption from hundreds of them throughout the state at this point. So stuff's happening, and it's going to be hard to put those trucks back in the toothpaste tube, so to speak.
Well, that's a good line, because I've done research around the port, and the most common routes that I've seen for electrification out of the ports are from just call them the Port of LA, even though it's San Pedro, Long Beach, but we'll just call it Port of LA, for simplicity, is from there to the Inland Empire, from there to Fountain Valley, and there to Barstow, we have the Railhead by BNSF. And you're starting to see these consistent back and forth runs with these electric trucks, and those are gaining traction. Are you seeing anything in your data from, say, San Diego to Oakland? Are you seeing any of those longer runs yet? And if so, are there any early movements around heavy-duty charging infrastructure to do those longer runs, or even going up into Oregon, which are traditional trucking routes?
Yeah, good question. So one of the more interesting opportunities I get in this work, and my coworkers get in this work, is we get to go visit most of these fleets. So we're probably 95, 98% census almost, in terms of many of those 250 fleets that we reported on this past year. We've been to. One of our 5 staff members who does site visits has been to those. And so, I think there's maybe 5 brands of electric semi-trucks that we've seen on the market so far. One of them, on the smaller side, startup, they've got probably the biggest batteries, 750 kilowatt hours, something like that. Pretty fast charging. People are starting to talk about megawatt charging. What we're seeing for the most part is 350 is the fast side. I haven't actually seen any trucks charging at 350 kW, but we're seeing like 250, maybe 300 kW. So we're not really there in terms of long distance trucking, but we are in a place where there's some opportunity to kind of Pony Express it and do some truck swapping. There's a few main vendors, that are doing that. But most of the time, what we're seeing is swapping trucks regionally. I'm not seeing a whole lot of really going San Francisco, Oakland to LA necessarily. But we are seeing some pretty high utilization in some cases where there's a really dialed in operation. They've got the right drivers, they've got the right logistics staff, they've got the right trucks and charging. And their drivers might be swapping trucks once or twice a day, and those trucks might be just constantly hopping around doing 2 or 3 shifts. So not really seeing the long distance, but we are seeing some impressive 2 and 3 shift a day driving for these trucks in some cases. And we'll see. It's still kind of an early market. We've got some startups in the heavy duty world. We've got some longer term players in the heavy duty world. It's still pretty early. And for now, what I'd say is a success is really seeing those 2 and 3 shift operations, just keeping those trucks hot and moving, even though it's more regional based. A lot of them seem to be staying within 150 miles of their base to make sure they can make it.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So, Summer, then are you seeing charging on both ends of that journey, or is it just you go out, drop, and go back and charge? Where are you seeing the infrastructure?
Yeah, so the more aggressive players are charging on both ends of it. So maybe 100 miles, 150 miles apart, something like that. The more conservative ones are sticking to maybe a 100-mile radius to make sure their trucks can get out and get back, and then maybe changing their game a little bit from what they used to be doing with their conventional diesel trucks. Now they're, saying, all right, our EVs are only going to go this far, and we're going to always try to aim for that maybe 3/4 range route, and then see how many short routes we can make happen in the same day for our drivers. So, and that's been super interesting to talk to some of these guys who are experimenting and, learning. And, one of my favorite questions to ask any of these fleets is, have you run out of juice? Have you gotten your truck or your school bus stuck? And very few of them have done that. And the ones that do it, I would say, 3 out of 5, maybe 4 out of 5 of the folks that have said they've actually run out of range on their vehicles. They did it on purpose, and they did it early on to figure out what their capability of these vehicles would be. And I've so far, in my own cars, I've only run out a couple times in the last 15 years. But to see people purposefully do it is pretty cool. And it reminds me of a time driving my old sports car with my brother and some friends, and I made them push me to the last block down the gas station so I could find out how, just how far my gas tank would take me. So we're definitely seeing some people think about things logically and really push their limits, which is pushing the market and being super insightful. And some of these guys have turned into what we call deep dives or case studies, where we'll do 5 or 10 of these 3-page case studies a year. And so we've got a lot of these kind of success stories that are talking about how well the vehicles work, how good their charging is taking place, stuff like that towards the end of our report. So there's a lot of little things we're trying to point out and really try to push the market and push the industry and push the audience to think about things so they can do a little better and find some confidence in making this new tech work for themselves.
A lot of little things equal a really good big thing. If you go back to the early days of electrification, going back to let's call it the roadster days, utilities of what they would move slower than slow. Well, we don't want this. Has it gotten any better? And I ask that because when I look at electrification for vehicles, there's a new emerging risk, the new golden child, data centers. Oh, and so it's just they're competing for energy, especially certain markets over other markets. How is that factoring in? The utilities finally moving ahead and making the upgrades? Or are they saying, oh, we want the data center business? How is that all evolving today?
Yeah, I mean, data centers and AI, it's definitely happening. But before I really respond to that, I'll also say what's been impressive in California is looking at the CAISO data, looking at the regional grid operator in California. They've got some really good reports that are, updated daily in some cases, talking about how much renewable energy is coming on the grid. And, the last 5 years, 10 years, what we've seen is more and more solar is getting curtailed, and a little bit of wind is getting curtailed. So in many cases, we actually have too much solar that we don't have a place to put it. And that's factoring back into utility rates, where we're seeing some of the lowest cost energy now be in the middle of the afternoon, late morning, early afternoon is some of the lowest cost energy. And so that concept of how much energy, how much power capacity do we have is a real one, and it's a dynamic market coming from a lot of different variables there. So the question was how is the utility world kind of influencing or responding to what's going on? And I think something that happened in California around 2015 was California passed Senate Bill 350, which, among many other things energy related, gave the utilities opportunity to basically start investing in EV charging for fleets, for schools, and in a couple of different assembly bills here, and parks and fast charge plazas. In some ways, that's really spurred the market, because now the utility could take the cost burden away from individual fleet operators, for instance, and they could take a lot of the design roles on instead of having the fleets get involved in that. On the other hand, what we've seen in the report is it takes, from the time a fleet has applied to these programs till the time they get activated and commissioned and operating or capable of operating the chargers, it's a pretty long period. It could be, 2 years, 3 years for the application process. And we've got that, somewhere in this 562 page fantastic report that my coworkers and colleagues, different companies have put together. So, there's always a little bit of give and take. I think we're seeing maybe longer times, because we've got some mix of the utility doing work they don't historically do with the fleets doing some work on their own. So we might be seeing some longer time periods, but less cost onto the people operating the EVs, which might encourage them to do this. In the past year, we've also seen, I think, Rule 45 and Rule 29, depending on which utility we're talking about, which really simplifies that. It's a different funding mechanism. Basically lets the utilities do kind of the typical work they do, bring power to a certain place, and then the operator does everything else. And so that right there has less involvement from the utilities, and in some cases we're seeing might be a good opportunity to expedite how long it takes to get your electric vehicle charging infrastructure built. So kind of couple sides of the coin there, and definitely seeing some evolution over the last few years, even up until today, basically.
Do you feel the faster, this is from the public charging standpoint, the faster, reliable, I got to use the word reliable there, EV charging infrastructure comes online, the faster we could potentially see adoption if consumers begin to see charging everywhere where it's not broken, but it's actually people are charging? Could that help accelerate the adoption, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fascinating thing for me, going back to when I first started playing with electric vehicles and talking to people about it, and people trying to make their own cars with lead acid batteries 15 years ago. I mean, I worked at a utility company. I was very lucky that they let me charge my home built car back in the day, just using a regular old outlet. And I think what's, in most of the US, there's electricity everywhere. I drove through a national forest this weekend, and, I'm seeing power lines and transformers go through this national forest. And granted, they also have a transmission line going through that forest. But there was small enough power that we could use. So I mean, in most places there's electricity, and for most people, even just a little bit of power running on 120 volts can be super helpful. And that's what's really struck me, for so many years on end, is there's just so much opportunity to get electricity in places. And how do we do that? How do we motivate to do that? How do we afford to do that? Especially the last 5 years. Everything seems to be going up in price. So whether you want to get copper, whether you want to, do some cement work, whether you want to get this appliance over here, everything's going up in price, and it's maybe getting a little harder to do some of these projects. But there's power everywhere. And one of the, I think, really cool things we've seen is some really smart level one. So basically 120 volt charging take place. We've seen some examples curbside coming off of light posts, or 120 volt charging going into multi-unit dwelling apartment condo buildings that's smart. And, it could be as simple as a plug with a smart circuit breaker behind it that lets you identify who's charging and, make them pay for it, or allow them to pay for it. And sometimes a lot of people have kind of drawn away focus. I mean, we were talking about megawatt charging on the commercial truck side just now. And that's new, and people are pushing for that. And that's going to be expensive to build. It's going to be expensive to buy, like we were talking about. Some of the utility rates have to do with how fast people are charging. So megawatt charging is very fast, and you're going to pay for it. But 120 volt charging is great. It's not perfect, but it can do some real good work, especially considering how many hours a day most vehicles sit, how many hours a year. So, in the past, I've said maybe my best role was making excuses, and generally that's making excuses to make things happen, to get stuff done and try some stuff out. So, yeah, putting charging in more places for people to more reliably, conveniently charge their vehicles is pretty important. And sometimes it's making an excuse to do something that most people don't think is worthwhile, like level one charging.
Sometimes you gotta take a gamble and try things. So Jason, I want you to take all this. I want you to put it together and make a pie, because it's Thanksgiving here. What is the future of electric vehicle charging for fleets and everyday drivers? What is it going to look like?
Yeah. So I like to make excuses, as I was talking about. So I want to see people make excuses. One of my favorite things to talk about is charging layouts. And I think that from what we see, a lot of charging is faster than need be. And we see a lot of fleets aren't operating all day long, aren't operating all week long. And so we have some opportunity to kind of dovetail charging for this demographic, charging for that demographic. So I really think a couple of things are important here. Like, when you're going to install charging, put your get as long of a cord as possible. The longest cords we're seeing on level 2 and level 1 is about 25 feet. The longest cords we're seeing on DC fast charging is coming up close to that, 20, maybe 25 feet. I'm not sure what the spec is there. But I think it's super important to get as long of a cord as possible and put that charging station in somewhere that reaches as many parking spots as possible. And especially when you're talking about maybe medium duty vehicles or pickup trucks for your fleet, there's a lot of opportunity to share charging between employees and the public and your fleet vehicles. So I really do think being conscientious about how much electrical capacity you need and build is important, and trying to spread that capacity out throughout as much of the day, the week, the year as possible. And using software, choosing software that is proven to be able to do charging management and load management, so you can avoid the high costs, so you can avoid spiking of energy and take more time to charge. And, use the same assets for your fleet vehicles as you use for the public and your employees. I think doing things smart and improving the utilization of that infrastructure is really what I'd point at. And the more we do that, the more renewable energy we'll use. And I think that's pretty exciting, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, you said it, and I'll simplify it. The software layer unlocks a lot of efficiencies if it's deployed properly and managed properly. Jason, this has been a super insightful conversation. As we look to wrap up today, what would you like our listeners to take away with them?
Well, I want you guys to find excuses to go try something, to go have a conversation, and to not just be satisfied or settle for what happens. Do some research, do some digging, talk to people, go find the cheapest energy possible, go find the cleanest energy, have conversations with folks, let them know, and to really think about how to dovetail as much of this as possible so we can, again, improve that utilization rate and keep these things hot, keep them used, make them popular. But, as far as that goes, I think policy is super important. So let's think about how many, who the demographics are, and really think about policy and culture, and shaping culture is so important when we're working with people, just helping people set their expectations so that we can all work together and be productive and be appreciative of each other. So, policy and culture is a big one. I'll just wrap up with that one. Let's work together and really think about that.
That's brilliant. And I'll dovetail on that. Try new things, ask questions. You never know what you're going to learn. Today is tomorrow. Tomorrow is today. The future is electric. Jason, thank you so much for coming on SAE Tomorrow Today.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to SAE Tomorrow Today. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, please kindly rate, review, and let us know what topics you'd like for us to explore next. Be sure to join us next week for another episode of SAE Tomorrow Today Unplugged, where I'll share my thoughts and insights into markets and the future of mobility.
SAE International makes no representations as to the accuracy of the information presented in this podcast. The information and opinions are for general information only. SAE International does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast.